We now come to the discussion segment of the panel, and I am pleased to introduce our two discussants today. Our first is Professor Sookyeon, a professor of international law at Rikkyo University College of Law. Professor He is chiefly interested in the international spatial order, covering both the law of territory as well as the law of the sea. So she's covered the whole earth. And in the latter, her research has covered dispute settlement as well as marine scientific research. Our second discussant is Director Hyeon Kim of the Green Diplomacy Division of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Korea. Director Kim has a doctorate in international environmental law, and her career with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in her career with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has served in a number of capacities, including a stint with the Embassy of Korea in Singapore. I'm told we have 30 minutes for the discussion. I'm going to give 10 minutes to each of the discussants, and then I'll give all the speakers a few minutes each to respond. So let me give the floor first to Professor He, please.
Good afternoon, Excellencies and their respected colleagues and distinguished speakers. And thank you for introducing me, Chief Executive Rena. I'm Sookyeon, and allow me to express my gratitude for having me here to the organizer, the Korean Society of International Law and Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Korea and the International Tribunal for Law of the Sea. And so thank you for your wonderful presentation of the distinguished speakers of this session. To consider the issues on BBNJ and to imagine how a new international legal binding instrument would be, I find it structurally challenging. If I may say so in front of the chairperson and the participants at the BBNJ Intergovernmental Conference, to draft the BBNJ treaty seems a mission impossible partly because the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction requires full commitment to new approaches and new elements that were only partially incorporated in the UNCLOS regimes. At the same time, our new BBNJ treaty is mandated to maintain the consistency with the UNCLOS, that Rena said, under the UNCLOS. So I have the impression that the three speakers today were responding to the dilemma between the full commitment to new approaches and the consistency with the existing UNCLOS. So new approaches or elements required by the BBNJ in my mind is two, among other approaches, the ecosystem approach and sharing scheme. The ecosystem approach, actually after listening to Dr. VERLAAN's presentation, I'm not sure this terminology is adequate. I may be able to paraphrase the ecosystem approach to an integrated approach. So what I want to mean by the integrated approach here is not a rigid concept, a loose way of saying the responses or regulatory action should be based on objectives rather than by zones or by subject matter or human-made jurisdiction or boundaries or something. So in terms of not limiting regulation to one fish species, the Article 5 of the Fish Stock Agreement can be considered to introduce an integrated approach in the UNCLOS framework. Yeah. So the sharing scheme is about benefit sharing in wider meaning here that includes capacity building and technology transfer as well. So the first, talking about the integrated approach, actually integrated approach is very different in the nature from the high sea governance of the UNCLOS. The high sea governance in UNCLOS has been coordinating the interests of states and ad hoc basis with the key concept, the due regards. So the uniqueness or strangeness of the integrated approach to the high seas governance is obvious. So I want to repeat the details of this point here, but you will understand the difficulties of the integrated approach to the high sea governance with the consistency of the UNCLOS. The second point is about sharing. So about the access and benefit sharing of generic resources, it has also been adopted already in the Nagoya Protocol to CBD. But however, it must be borne in mind that the background incentives are different between generic resources within the national territory and in the area beyond the national jurisdiction. In the case of resources on the territory, the researching countries or researcher have incentives to provide the benefit sharing or capacity building to the state which the generic resources are belong to, because the preservation of the habitats is solely left to the state which the resource is located at. So without capacity building or benefit sharing, the state can harm, how can I say, without capacity building, the habitats might be in danger. So on the other hand, in area beyond national jurisdiction, there is no country where the generic resources are located. So it is unlikely for most of developing states to harm the marine environment in area beyond national jurisdiction. So thus, there is no incentives for developed countries to provide developing countries with capacity building. So as for benefit sharing, even if the common heritage of mankind principle is not introduced in the new BBNJ treaty, I think that some sort of same aspiration as common heritage of mankind needs to be shared in order to make the benefit sharing scheme to work. And furthermore, there's a difficulty, again, of designing and accessing the benefit sharing system so as to consistent with the freedom of the high sea in the UNCLOS, especially the compatibility between the marine scientific research system and the ABS access and the benefit sharing system that has been which has been rightly pointed out by Professor Nishimoto. And having said that, I believe that importance of protecting marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, and it cannot be left to the principle of freedom of the high seas. So that requires a new approaches beyond or under UNCLOS. But at the same time, it needs a continuity with the existing rules in order to secure the norm function. So it would be necessary to simplify the complexity of the situations for the sake of being norms work. So for the sake of being working norms. So I'd therefore like to ask the three honorable colleagues a few questions. My question I'd like to ask all of you is basically, how much can we expect from the new treaty in the face of such difficulties? So my concern may be misplaced, so if so, please tell me. I would be relieved to know so. But if my concerns are still persuasive, I would like to ask the question how a new BBNJ treaty will be able to coping with these difficulties. And I'd like to ask each of the speakers to answer this question with special emphasis that I'm going to say now. And about the first presentation made by Dr. VERLAAN, I have also been wondering if emphasizing the conservation of marine biodiversity should serve to a preservation of marine environment. It seems to me that protecting marine biodiversity in BBNJ negotiations means protecting biodiversity hotspots or protecting habitats. So that's why they are talking about the topic of area-based management. So according to your thought, Dr. VERLAAN, is it correct that this focus on particular ecosystems or habitats in BBNJ treaty might be not consistent with the obligation of preserving the maritime environment as a whole enshrined in the UNCLOS? And if possible, I'd like to hear your thought on how precise legal definition of scientific concept needs to be and how it can be done. So lawyers need some room within the definition for interpretation to cope with the individual situation. However, the definition should not be arbitrary, so especially in the scientific point of view. So I'd like to know the boundaries or definition, frontiers of some legal definition. And about second presentation, Dr. MOSSOP, I found your argument about erga omnes character and the proposal of non-compliance procedure very thought-provoking. And my question is, how can the proposed non-compliance procedure be achieved in a way that is consistent with UNCLOS? I would not say the dispute settlement system of UNCLOS is self-contained regime, but it is highly integrated framework, so we have to pay attention to. And what do you think about how to create initiatives for the developed countries accepting the non-compliance procedure, including the financial assistance? The last and not least, Professor Nishimoto, you have explained a really difficult issue very well. I'm always learning from you since we are studying together at graduate schools. And I'd like to hear your candid thoughts on a BBNJ treaty's possibility. And I have a simple question as well. Do you think that the clearinghouse system will maintain the incentives for keeping MSR in area beyond national jurisdiction by developed countries, having considered all problems you address in your presentation, especially permit or licensing MSR regime? Yes, that brings me the end of my comments. Thank you for your kind attention.
Well, thank you very much, Sookyeon, for summing up the dilemma between new approaches and consistency so succinctly. Not, I would say, mission nearly, but not entirely impossible. Let me give the floor now to Director Kim, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Rena, for the kind introduction. I'm pleased to attend the 6th International Conference on the Law of the Sea, and I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to MOFA, ICLOS, and Korea Society of International Law for organizing such a great event. Today, I'm attending this conference in my personal capacity, so what I comment today is my personal opinion and observation, not representing the official position of the Korean government. When I first look at the session program, I noticed that something interesting about the session topic, which is promoting biodiversity beyond UNCLOS, as Rena mentioned, since we are dealing with the BBNJ instrument under the mandate of under the UNCLOS. So beyond the UNCLOS made me think about two things regarding the BBNJ discussions. The first one is the necessity of a BBNJ international instrument. And the second thing is the guiding principles for the negotiation of a BBNJ instrument. The first aspect is about why we need a BBNJ international instrument. In a nutshell, BBNJ is necessary since UNCLOS has difficulty in addressing and providing regulatory norms to new emerging challenges. Since the adoption of UNCLOS in 1982, science and technology and navigation and communication skills have advanced considerably, and human activities have become more diverse and complex. So human can access to areas that were not previously explored. Accordingly, new challenges emerged not anticipated at the time of the adoption of UNCLOS. As many participants previously mentioned, UNCLOS has been evolving into prominent implementing agreement. The Deep Seabed Agreement and UNFSA has been adopted. Now, we will expect the third international implementing agreement regarding UNCLOS to address the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in the area of beyond national jurisdiction. In this respect, we can say that BBNJ can be set as the norm for promoting biodiversity beyond UNCLOS. The second aspect is regarding the guiding principles for BBNJ negotiations. Based on the resolution of the 59th UN General Assembly in 2004, the ad hoc open-ended informal working group to study issues relating to the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity beyond areas of national jurisdiction was firstly decided to establish. At the 9th working group in 2015, the international community agreed to develop a legally binding international document. So it took 10 years to build a consensus that international norms are needed for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in ABNJ, and reached an agreement to draft an international instrument. Since then, the international community has made a lot of efforts, but it is true that there still are gaps of opinions among countries regarding key issues. So I would like to emphasize that in this process, a realistic approach and mindset is truly necessary for dealing with major issues in ABNJ, not trying to solve the issues at once through the BBNJ agreement. To this end, we need to keep in mind that the guiding principles for discussing BBNJ should be under the UNCLOS and should not undermine. As stipulated in the resolution 72249, what we are doing is negotiating an international legally binding instrument under the UNCLOS, and BBNJ cannot be discussed in isolation from UNCLOS. In addition, according to the same resolution, BBNJ process and its result should not undermine existing relevant legal instruments and frameworks and relevant global, regional, and sectoral bodies. This is because if these principles are not preserved, situations may arise in which countries have to follow different and sometimes conflicting regulations. In addition, we should not forget that the two values of biodiversity conservation and sustainable use in ABNJ are not in conflict with each other. It is the BBNJ instrument to create new norms and international regimes to harmonize and complement those two values. Now, I would like to make my brief comment on today's presentations. The first, thank Dr. VERLAAN for the presentation regarding the interface of science and law, which is very interesting. It reminds me once again of the need to distinguish between biodiversity and the environment, as well as the need for a differential and accurate application of the concept of protecting, preserving, conservation, which had been vaguely applied. Thank you for this. I totally agree that the role of science and new technology is important in applying these concepts accurately in practice. In particular, the best available science and technology must be supported in order to achieve the objectives of the environmental conventions by implementing them. Although norms play a facilitating role, they also have a feature of regulating. So the principles alone, such as precautionary principles, are not sufficient. In this respect, science and technology can play a certain role in setting standards and regulations. In addition, Continuous communication and exchange of views between scientists and policymakers is essential in setting norms for environment issues, since environment affairs has more scientific and technical aspect than we think. And only through this, based on an accurate understanding of reality, a proper policy directions can be established. As Professor MOSSOP presented, dispute settlement is an issue that the parties have not paid much attention so far compared to other major issues. However, dispute settlement is one of important cross-cutting issues which needs to be addressed in the new BBNJ instrument. And I really appreciate Professor Joanna for giving a chance to look at such significant issue. In Professor Joanna's speech, erga omnes norms is touched on. From the practical perspective, further discussion is needed as to whether the issues to be addressed through the BBNJ agreement are subject to erga omnes norms. In this respect, it is useful to identify the potential nature of dispute under the BBNJ instrument. So what kind of dispute we can expect and how much technical aspect the dispute has. To add one more thing, Professor Joanna mentioned non-compliance procedures as one of the alternatives to dispute resolution. Personally, I think non-compliance procedures and dispute settlement mechanisms are different and separate one, since the basic objectives are fundamentally different. Thus, even in the current draft text of BBNJ, implementation and dispute settlement are addressed under the separate part. Lastly, I would like to talk about marine scientific research. ABNJ is still uncharted territory for humankind. Given the lack of scientific knowledge about ABNJ, I believe that the role of science is necessary, especially given that all 4 major issues in BBNJ require scientific knowledge. I would like to thank Professor NISHIMOTO for reminding us of this important point through this presentation. Marine scientific research at ABNJ is a task that requires skills, money, and time, especially for developing countries. MSR, ABNJ can pose a real challenge. So in order to close the knowledge gap and the opportunity gap, the demand for capacity building and technology transfer is expected to continue. In this regard, clearinghouse mechanism is considered to be an important platform for the exchange and sharing of scientific knowledge. Considering that MSR also belongs to human activities conducted in the ABNJ and will affect marine environment to some extent, MSR in ABNJ is also subject to the regulation of the BBNJ instrument. However, as Professor Nishimoto emphasized, we need to focus on facilitating the positive role of MSR in the process of BBNJ negotiation, which can contribute to the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in ABNJ. I would like to close my comment by re-emphasizing 3 points for the process of BBNJ instrument discussion. First, bear in mind the guiding principles under the UNCLOS should not undermine. Second, strike the balance between the 2 precious values, conservation and sustainable use. Lastly, those principles and balanced values must be echoed and reflected in the clauses for the BBNJ instrument. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Hyeon, for those most excellent comments. In the interest of time, I'm going to jump straight to the speakers, each of whom have about 3 to 4 minutes to try to answer all the questions that have been posed to them. Let me start first with Philomène, who is in the grip of an Arctic chill, and I hope she gets warmer. Philomène, please.
Yeah. Thank you all. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers very much for this invitation. I did not want to use my presentation time for this. I wanted to do this because it was pre-recorded. I wanted to do this in person live to the group. I am very, very honored to be asked to contribute to this very important discussion. I believe I only had one direct question addressed to me by Dr. Hu, and I hope I have understood it correctly. If I haven't, forgive me, because I don't have much time, but I think she asked how much we can expect from the ILBI in terms of protecting the marine environment. And in particular, I think she asked whether marine biodiversity hotspots can be protected without protecting the marine environment. And I'm going to answer the second question first by saying no. And Dr. He herself, in a way, answered her question with her very kind introduction to her own talk by saying that she felt that she needed to shift her own terminology from ecosystem to integrated management, which is a summary in basically 2 words of what I spent 23 minutes trying to say. So thank you very much, Dr. Hu. And until the ILBI and every other treaty, by the way, not just the ILBI, that is being drafted or that is currently being implemented, and that includes the convention, which I have identified as being a convention that is also not being implemented fully. Unless we are going to start thinking holistically about not only our marine environment, but about our planet as a whole, no instrument is going to be able to deal with that. So, and selecting hotspots, when you look at how they're defined, they never have a proper scientific definition. They are always defined in terms of anthropomorphic requirements. This is not a way to protect any type of group of living organisms. For one thing, we do not know how to draw the boundaries even between ourselves and our immediate circumstances as humans, let alone in these far more complex environments that we have to deal with and that we have the hubris to try to think we can manage. So I think it would be much better to start thinking integration from the beginning. And this is indeed hugely, hugely difficult, and good luck with the ILBI to try to address this, because I have to emphasize the intentions are noble, and I totally support the intentions. I just wish I could have more faith in that the execution would actually do any good. With regard to Dr. Kim, this wasn't a question, but I did want to say very briefly that amongst the many important points she made, the one that most resonated with me is to not expect the ILBI to do everything. And in an ideal world, if I had to advise the negotiators now, please break up the ILBI into 3 separate protocols at least, one that focuses purely on marine genetic resources, for one thing. One that if you are going to address the problem of MPAs, then in high seas, but then address it right. Really, really think about it, and think about how you can at least develop a no-take and a no-take, a no-take and a no-go zone, as I talked about, in order to at least build in some of the resilience that is going to be necessary for all these zones to have to deal with deoxygenation, acidification, noise pollution, plastic, and all the hundreds of horsemen of the apocalypse that the ocean is facing, for which the ILBI can do absolutely nothing. And I believe that is probably my 3 or 4 minutes. Please, folks, think holistically. The convention doesn't help because it also divides everything into jurisdictions immediately after saying the problems of ocean space must be considered as a whole. Let's at least consider them as a whole, even though we're dealing with all these different jurisdictions out there which have no scientific relevance whatsoever. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Philomène. Very quickly to Joanna, please.
Yes, thank you. I'm conscious that I've got very little time. I do want to thank both of the discussants for their very eloquent and insightful comments, and I really wish we could have a longer conversation, but I'll just address a couple of points. And first of all, a little bit of clarification. So a non-compliance procedure would not be considered to be part of a dispute settlement process. It's separate in the treaty in different places, well, very close to each other, but they're not clearly not in the same parts of the treaty. However, my argument is that if you're trying to ensure that states comply with their obligations and you can't necessarily rely on traditional dispute settlement to do your job for you, then having these non-compliance procedures is a good and it's a great way to try and achieve the same goal, but in a slightly different and a more friendly way than trying to rely solely on dispute settlement. And I think that it is entirely consistent with the Law of the Sea Convention to put these in place. Even though it doesn't appear in the Law of the Sea Convention, non-compliance procedures really sort of took on great currency in the 1990s. You know, enough countries are familiar with them that hopefully it's not too controversial. And I think we have to be careful in assuming that anything that isn't in UNCLOS necessarily means that we can't put it in another treaty. So it's the opportunity to do that progression of international law that Professor He was talking about. And I completely agree that there's an issue about incentives for developed countries to provide capacity building, and that's one of the key problems at the moment with the capacity building strand. And I do have to acknowledge that one of the problems we have here is the developed countries are able to draw lines in the sand because they don't have as much to gain from the BBNJ as perhaps the developing countries do. And unlike UNCLOS, where everyone had something to gain. For some of the developed countries, I think, you know, they'd be quite happy if there was never a BBNJ treaty. So that's a real challenge in terms of how you build those incentives into a text to come up with a reasonably effective agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Kentaro, please.
First of all, thank you to the two discussants for the excellent points raised. And I also wish we had more time to discuss because I would have liked to respond to many of the very important issues raised. But I believe I had one direct question from Professor He, which was about incentives for developing states to conduct marine scientific research. And this question was in relation to the clearinghouse mechanism. Would the clearinghouse mechanism be sort of enough incentive? I'm not sure, and I think it would depend on what kind of results we are expecting from the operation of this clearinghouse mechanism. So I think, well, this is a really bad answer, but I think it will depend on what kind of clearinghouse mechanism we will be looking at. But I would see utility, of course, always for more international cooperation in conducting marine scientific research. And of course, a lot of efforts have been done bilaterally, also through international organizations such as UNESCO ILC. So I would see a benefit in promoting further cooperation through the BBNJ agreement. But at the same time, one point that I might add to this question of incentive in conducting marine scientific research is that it is probably also important not to provide disincentives. And in my presentation, I argued that maybe permit or licensing scheme would be considered in contravention of the freedom of marine scientific research. But I also consider it inadvisable because, for example, states with very large EEZs, like in the case of Japan, in that kind of situation, if the same scientific observations or if the same kind of research projects can be conducted in areas within national jurisdiction, and if there are certain cumbersome requirements for conducting scientific research activities beyond areas of national jurisdiction, then those scientists may simply choose to conduct their research in the EEZ. Of course, if there's something unique to the ABNJ, of course, they would have the incentive to do that. But if the conditions are the same, that we might have scientists maybe doing research slightly closer to their coastline. So I think it's very important not to provide disincentives, but yes, so I think that is one consideration that must be taken into account. And I think I should stop there because of the time constraints. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kentaro. I know we've already busted our time, so it only leaves me to thank all our speakers as well as our discussants for a very stimulating discussion. I hope that those of you who are involved in the IGC will be inspired, will learn and will renew our determination to achieve Mission Impossible. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good rest of the session. Thank you.
Thank you.